Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the ICAN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start today's class by the personality of the day, which is we're going to talk about the forest man of India, JADAV Malai PAYENG. So, JADAV, he belongs to Assam, and when he was 16-year-old, there was a drought there, and he saw that hundreds of snakes had died there due to extreme heat. After that, he started planting one sapling every day in the middle of the Majuli island of Assam. So he single-handedly planted an entire forest to this day in the Majuli island. When he started planting a single sapling every day, he did this for over a period of 35 years. And today, his forest spans across more than 1,300 acres of forests are now there in that region. So when the drought had happened, that time the scientists had told that the Majuli Island would die after a catastrophic drought. But today it has been transformed to a rich forest where even the Royal Bengal tigers, rhinos, elephants, reptiles, deers are all inhabiting the forest. And he has been called to various states to even demonstrate how to manage forests also. And he was also awarded the Padma Shri Award, which is the highest civilian award in India. And also, it's important to note that his parents were very poor people, and they actually made a living by selling milk. And along with Jadav, he had 12 more siblings. So it shows how sheer hard work, his perseverance over a period of 35 years to plant one sapling each day. So his consistency shows how even a barren island, which scientists called would be a catastrophe, was transformed into such a rich forest. So with hard work, one can undergo any kind of transformation, and this amount of perseverance is the only thing that is required for it. So with this, we will start the first topic of the day, which is the Anti-Defection Law. So Anti-Defection Law has been in news because of what is happening in Madhya Pradesh. So let's see what is happening there. In fact, Shivraj Singh Chauhan of the BJP was sworn in as the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh. So before that, 22 Congress MLAs had resigned, and Supreme Court had ordered that the Speaker should conduct a floor test, in which the incumbent Chief Minister had resigned even before the floor test because of the fear of losing confidence, and ultimately the Shivraj Singh Chauhan led government was sworn in Madhya Pradesh. So this has brought to fore the question of anti-defection law again. Let us see. Even before, there have been some previous instances when the anti-defection law has been misused. For instance, in Karnataka also, the H.D. Kumaraswamy-led Congress government was there, but 17 MLAs of the ruling government resigned and they joined BJP. And so even that time, these 17 MLAs were not were not considered to be disqualified under anti-defection law, and they had joined BJP, which led to toppling of the Congress-led government. So there have been previous several instances where the anti-defection law has been misused. So now let us see detail about anti-defection law. So this particular law was brought about in 1985 by the 52nd Amendment, and it has provisions for the disqualification of elected members on the grounds of defection. So it was mentioned in the 10th schedule of the Constitution, and you can find the details in Articles 1022 and 191(2) of the Constitution. So in these two articles mention about the anti-defection law. So now let us see why was it actually brought about. During the 1980s, before that, there was a tendency that several members, they were lured by political offices and they were shifting their parties. So there had come a tendency which was described as Aya Ram Gaya Ram. So no person had a permanent political party to which he or she belonged to. Depending upon the the how politically lured the person was, he would keep shifting from one party to the other. So this led to corruption, this led to horse trading, and this led to toppling of the government, and it led to a lot of instability. So because of which the anti-defection law was brought about. This helped to bring in some stability to the government. It also provided it also promoted party loyalty and also party discipline. So because of all these reasons, the anti-defection law was brought about in 1985. Now let us understand the grounds. That is the grounds under which a person is said to be disqualified. So first is that if an elected member if an elected member voluntarily gives up the membership of the political party to which he belongs, then if a member votes or he abstains from voting against the directions of the whip, and there are other grounds also, like if a nominated member joins a political party after a period of 6 months, then this is also a ground for disqualification. And if an independent member joins a political party, then also it is a case for disqualification. So these are the grounds for disqualification. But what happened was, when the law was originally enacted, it provided that if 1/3 members of the political party were to defect, then that would be considered as a split in the political party, and it was allowed. But this led to mass defections. So it was said that horse trading became from retail to wholesale. So this led to mass defections where several would defect at the same time, so that it would be allowed as the split in the political party, and they would not attract any disqualification. So this was corrected by the 92nd Amendment, wherein it was amended that only if 2/3 people were to if 2/3 people were to come out of the party membership, only then it would be called as a split. So only then it will be allowed. So this was the amendment made in order to prevent mass defections. So now let us see several issues why this particular legislation has been in news, why anti-defection law has been in news from time to time. The first issue is that first of all, it is held that it curbs the dissent, or it curbs the freedom of expression of the legislator. So the legislator will have to abide by the direction of the party whip, and he or she cannot take any independent stance. So it curbs the freedom of expression of the legislator. The second one is, initially it was only the speaker or the chairman who had to decide upon this issue, and his or her decision would be final regarding the disqualification. But however, the Supreme Court, in a case called as Kyoto-Holohan case in 1992, held that the decision of the speaker is subject to judicial review, because it is possible that the speaker might act in a partisan manner, and therefore the speaker might even disqualify unnecessarily, or he or she may sit on a particular disqualification not taking any action. So that is why the decision of the speaker was made subject to judicial review under the Kyoto-Holohan case of 1992. So this was the second issue. The third was that it actually dilutes the debate in the parliament and the assembly. Why? Because either way, the legislators think that they either way will have to abide by what the whip says to vote or abstain from voting. So they don't have to engage in debates and discussions in the parliament. So this is how it dilutes the debates and discussion in parliament, which is a hallmark of democracy. So in a way, the law was diluting the democratic principles in the parliament. The fourth issue was there was no incentive to the MPs. There was no incentive to the MPs to come prepared to the parliament to research on a particular topic and understand the policies. So there was no such incentive to the MPs, because no matter how much research they do on a particular policy, whatever is the stance of the government, they will have to support that stance. So therefore there is no point in that. So there was no incentive to the MPs to come well prepared to research various areas of policies and come to the parliament. The next issue was, in fact, the members of the parliament, they represent their constituencies. So these constituencies may want the member to vote in a particular respect, but however, the party whip may direct the member to vote in a different respect. So in which case, it's actually like betraying the people. So the member may have to betray his constituency because he is bound by the direction of the whip. So this breaks the link between the elected representative and the elector. So also, because the member will have to go by the whip and not listen to his constituency, the voice of every region, the voice of every constituency may not be heard. The next issue is that there is no time limit within which the speaker will have to decide which speaker has to decide a case of disqualification. So a speaker who is partisan may just sit on a particular disqualification and not give any decision so as to favor the party to which he or she belongs. So this actually promotes the partisan behavior of the speaker because there is no time limit. The seventh issue is that also there is an as we see that an exception is made that if the person who is giving up the membership, if he becomes member of a new political party, then there is no disqualification. So this is what is happening, and this is leading to mass defections where more than 2/3, if they are voluntarily giving up the membership, it will be called as a merger into another political party. So this again, this clause is again being misused. All right, so these are all some of the issues, and now we will understand what reforms may be needed to overcome this issue. So first of all, time and again, the question that is asked is, do we really need anti-defection law at this point of time? The answer is yes, we need it, because without the anti-defection law, there will be more corruption, there will be more horse trading, and there will also be more instability in the government and more instability in the governance as well. So anti-defection law is needed, but at the same time, we need to incorporate some reforms into it. Now let us see what these reforms could be. The 170th report of the Law Commission had recommended that anti-defection law should be restricted only for confidence, no confidence motions. Only for such critical motions, the members must be made to abide by the directions of the whip, but for the other cases, the members must have the freedom to vote depending upon their own understanding of the policy and also representing their constituency. And the second was that the decision, this was recommended by Dinesh Goswami Committee also, and also the National Committee on Review of Working of Constitutions under Venkatachalaya. So it recommended that the decision, rather than being made by the speaker, should be made by the president or the governor on the advice of election commissioner. So this will ensure that the decision is non-partisan. And also the most important thing is that we must in our country promote ethical politics. So we must understand what ethical politics is all about. Even this common man should understand, so that he can hold the members of the parliament accountable to them. So public should in fact shun such political maneuvers. Only then in a country like India we can stop such practices. So this is very important. So this was a very recent thing that happened in January 2020, where the Supreme Court provided some guidelines for on matters related to the anti-defection law. So as I was telling, one of the issue is that for the speaker, there is no time limit within which he or she has to decide upon a disqualification. So Supreme Court has set 3 months as the time limit for the speakers to conclude the disqualification proceedings against the defectors. So they will not be able to sit over these disqualification proceedings. They can't sit over that. The second is to make sure that the proceedings and the ultimate disqualification is non-partisan. The Supreme Court has also recommended that the Parliament should constitute a permanent tribunal and this tribunal can be headed by a retired Supreme Court or High Court judge, and this tribunal will decide the cases of disqualification, so that the power doesn't lie in the hands of a speaker who may at times be partisan, so that doesn't happen. So this decision came in a case related to Manipur Congress MLA Shyam Kumar, who switched to BJP and became a minister after the party formed government in 2017. Okay, so this was the most recent happening in this topic. So now we will go to the next topic, which is about the shadow pandemic. So since the coronavirus lockdown has begun, there have been several cases where the women have faced domestic violence. In the previous videos of ICAN, we have seen the data given by the United Nations Women regarding how many women face gender violence, domestic violence globally. And also we have seen how the National Commission for Women had come out and told that there has been a rise, more than double rise in the number of women who are calling up and complaining about domestic violence. So the United Nations has called this a shadow pandemic. While there is a pandemic of the coronavirus that is going on in the country, there is also a shadow pandemic at the same time going on inside the homes of people, where the women are facing domestic violence and abuse at the hands of their intimate partners. So in order to overcome this shadow pandemic, Pune ZILA Parishad has come out with an interesting plan. So what the Pune ZILA Parishad has done is, these abusive husbands and the wife beaters, they will face institutional quarantine if there is a complaint of domestic violence against them. So these husbands will be sent to a quarantine facility, which could be a town hall or it could be a village lodge or any other facility. So this is what the Pune ZILA Parishad is now doing. And also related to this, there is a campaign on standing up against domestic violence, which is called as BAJAO campaign. So we will see about this campaign. This BAJAO campaign was started in 2008. It was an anti-domestic violence campaign under which the local residents were to take up a stand against any such domestic violence and physical abuse. Particularly, it sought to involve men for women. So the neighbors, especially men, they would go and ring the bell. They can ask for some very trivial things like a phone or water or tea. As you can see in the slide, somebody is ringing the bell asking for milk. Somebody is ringing the bell to ask if they've got a mail. So all of these trivial things, it is just to show the abuser that his actions are being watched and seen, and people can act against them. So this became very popular, and it even became a global campaign called as a Ring the Bell campaign. So this was actually launched in India by Breakthrough. Breakthrough is actually an international human rights organization that uses media, community mobilization, etc. to advocate justice, dignity for women, equality, and all that. So this is about Bell Bajao campaign, which you can quote in answers. Similarly, the Ring the Bell campaign as well. The next is e-technology in governance. This is an example for that. So KISAN RATH is a mobile app which the Ministry of Agriculture has come up with. So what this app is doing at present, farmers want to sell their produce to the market, and from the market it has to go to, from the mandis it has to go to various consumers. But then the most difficult aspect is the transport. So this app aims to facilitate this hurdle. So under this app, it will connect the farmers with the traders. So it is going to connect the farmers with the traders. Farmers and the traders. It is going to connect to trucks and tractors. So this app is developed by National Informatics Center. So what it will do is, for the farmers and traders, if they are searching for vehicles to transport their produce, it will enable them to avail for primary transport, where the farmer transports his produce from the farm to the mandis, or it could be the secondary transport, where from the mandis it will be transmitted to this various markets in the state or in interstate also. even processing units, railway stations, warehouses and all that. So here this application will connect the farmers and traders with the trucks. So this over 5 lakh trucks have been aggregated through the transport aggregators. So through such aggregation, this mobile app is working. So this is an example of e-technology in governance for the aid of the farmers. So there is also a topic, e-technology in the aid of farmers. Even for that, this example can be quoted in the answers. So we will move to the next topic, which is the public distribution system. So even last week we had seen how the SECC census has several families from that have been missing out when benefits were to be distributed to the families. So here again, in the PDS system, what has been observed in Purulia district of West Bengal is that several of the people, they have pledged their PDS cards as collaterals to the money lenders in the villages for the amounts that they have borrowed years ago. So they didn't have the PDS cards because they had surrendered them to the money lenders from whom they had taken loans. So this came into sight now because the government had announced that free ration would be made available to the vulnerable sections under the PDS scheme to all the families during the lockdown. So it was during this time that this particular case came into the picture. So this shows the inefficiency of the public distribution system. And last week I had asked a question. The question was, what are the factors that have, or I think the question was, what are the issues with respect to implementation of the welfare schemes in India? So PDS, Public Distribution System, is a welfare scheme. National Food Security Act is a welfare scheme, and you can see how the PDS cards have been pledged to the money lenders. So this is one of the very big inefficiency that has come to sight. So when writing answers to those kind of questions, you can quote this as a case study. So the next is a Kerala model. So recently it has been held that the Kerala model, Kerala has been very successfully, it is able to tide over the corona crisis. So all the other states, including the center, they are studying about the Kerala model, and it has even won appreciation across the globe for its efforts and successfully being able to flatten the curve. For that it has received appreciation. So firstly, we will see why we have to study the Kerala model. So here are some important data. For instance, the recovery rate in the state is 50% nearly, but the all India average is only 11%. So the recovery rate in Kerala is 50%, but all India average is only 11%. Also, mortality rate is 0.5% in Kerala, while all India average is 3.4%. So this shows that Kerala is doing definitely something right, that it is able to flatten the curve and is able to tide over such a huge crisis. So now let's see what are the lessons to be learned and what are the ingredients of this Kerala model. The first thing is a health system. So here the infrastructure and equipment, in that investment of over 4,000 crores was made in the infrastructure and the equipment. Also, there is Ardram Health Mission of Kerala, so which transformed the primary health centers into family health centers. So mass participation in the preventive health care was ensured. So even when the corona crisis actually began, so immediate on a war footing, the control rooms were set up, mock drills were organized, and several such steps were taken to ramp up the facilities in the healthcare units in the hospitals. So this is one thing about the Kerala health system. The second thing is the morale, particularly of the health personnel, where we have been hearing of instances where the health personnel have been hit, they have been beaten down. So in such a backdrop, the initiative taken by the Kerala government to keep the morale of the health personnel very high is definitely noteworthy. So these health personnel were given special training. They were given the protective gear that they need to work safe, and also they were not made to work continuously for several days. There was a scientific duty rotation. So this is very important. There was scientific duty rotation also, And unlike other cases where the people where in the societies where these doctors stayed, so they did not want the doctors to come back to their homes, so there was a lot of social apathy. So societal apathy was visible in the other parts. So Kerala handled the societal apathy also, and the population expressed solidarity with the healthcare personnel, so that their morale is always high. The third is about the vulnerable sections. So we have already been seeing uh, the crisis of the migrants in India, and also of those families, the daily wagers and all that. So in order to help these vulnerable sections, Kerala government came out with a special package of 20,000 crore to fight the pandemic. So in which case 1,320 crore was utilized for providing 10,000 rupees as assistance to those families who were not eligible for any welfare pensions. And also 100 crore was spent for free food grains to the families, and 50 crore was spent for subsidized meals. So this shows how the Kerala government did not neglect the vulnerable sections and took special care for them. So the government has also provided interest-free consumption loans were provided. So this to 20,000 crore that we are talking about is a part of this welfare package, and an interest-free consumption loan of 2,000 crore was also provided, and 4 lakh, nearly 4 lakh meals per day was also distributed with the help of the community kitchens which have been set up by the local government. So this is how the Kerala government took care of the vulnerable sections. The next thing is the participative governance. So the government at the state level, at the local level, along with the SHGs, particularly the Kudumbashri, for distributing the 4 lakh meal every day, which also indicates a high level of women participation. There was participation of civil society organizations also in totally in tackling this crisis. And the civil society organizations also helped to ensure the accountability of the government. So all of these things were there. And why this participative governance actually happened in Kerala, because we can see that right from 1930s we had the temple entry movement, and then we had mass literature movement, and in the recent times we had gender and environmental movements. So all of these kind of pointed to a social citizenship, and in turn a social democracy, we can see, where people are empowered, and they are extremely aware of their rights and duties, and they participate wholeheartedly with the government through their support in tackling such crisis. So the foundations for this participative governance were laid by these movements, where the people became aware of their rights and duties. The next important ingredient was the planning. So planning was also in Kerala, multi-level planning was there. So there was a technical consultancy was given important. Then several working groups were formed, and so all of these coordination at various levels with the district administration, also from the state government. So all of these things were clearly planned in Kerala. Then when it comes to leadership, so if you see the Chief Minister of Kerala, he gives a daily briefing of 1 hour on all the steps taken on the new infections, on other do's and don'ts related to the corona crisis. Similarly, the Health Minister of Kerala, who is Shailaja teacher, also she has been even going to the people to ask about how they are doing at the time of the crisis. She had also played a wonderful role in the previous during the Nipah virus also in Kerala. So this shows that leadership is very effective and important in the period of crisis. So next is the level of trust. So there is an NGO in Bangalore called as Janagraha. So every year it holds a survey, and through this it finds that among the Malayalis across the gender, caste and religion, the trust levels are very high among the Malayalis regarding their institutions and their local government. So it found that the trust levels were very high. it is important to trust the government by the citizens. Only then they will abide by what the government tells them to do, because that is when the citizens feel that whatever the government is doing, it is for their interest, it is for their welfare. So this trust level among the Malayalis, the Janagraha found it to be very high. And also the last thing is that Kerala government is also found to be very futuristic and proactive, because it is already planning for exit from the lockdown, how the exit should happen in a phased manner. And also it is very much aware that there are so many migrants in the Gulf countries then who will eventually return back, and it is also planning for the migrants returning. In fact, already a capacity of more than 2 lakh for quarantining them has already been created by the government. So this shows that it is futuristic and it has planned for times to come also. So these are the important lessons that we need to learn from the Kerala model. So now we will the next one. So this is just the measures taken by the RBI to deal with the crisis. So one is that to liquidity measures it can take. So it has infused a liquidity of 1 lakh crore. So out of this 50,000 crore is for the NBFCs, and another 50,000 crore is for refinancing institutions like NABARD and SIDBI and National Housing Bank. And also it has increased the ways and means advance to the state governments to 60% now, which was 30% before. So these are just the simple measures taken by the RBI, because for all the measures to be successful, we need to have the measures taken by the RBI and also the government both together, which can bring about success. So these are the measures taken by the RBI, which can just be quoted. Next is the data on merchandise exports. We had seen this data before also. So according to the data, it shows that the merchandise exports have slipped by 34.6% in March compared to February. And also this we know is because of, first of all, the weakening of the global demand, because there is lockdown across the world and economic activity has come to a standstill at many places. And there is also a disruption of the supply chain, because China was also under lockdown. And also the data from Commerce Ministry shows that in March last year, the merchandise exports was $32.7 billion, and in March this year, it is March 20, it is nearly $21.4 billion. So this is a decrease in the merchandise exports compared to the last year. So this has been the effect of COVID. So while quoting that, you can quote this graph and quote the corresponding figures. So next we will discuss the question that I had asked last week. The question was to highlight the issues which the implementation of welfare schemes in India are facing, and also to suggest some reforms. So when we talk about welfare schemes, so how do you begin the answers? So we know that the preamble of India calls India to be a socialistic country, and there are directive principles of state policy which declares India to be a welfare state. We have several articles like 38, 41, 45, 48, which talks about several vulnerable sections like the women, the children, the old, the backward classes, etc. So all these puts a duty on the government to come out with these welfare schemes for an inclusive socio-economic development. So this is the purpose for launching several welfare schemes. So now if you have to talk about the issues faced by them, see, any scheme, I had particularly asked implementation, but a scheme's implementation will only be as good as its formulation, and also as good as our ability to take back lessons from faulty implementation. So we also need to talk a little bit about formulation and also the feedback, because there is a policy cycle which runs, which runs in a cyclical manner. So there is policy formulation, implementation, execution, evaluation, monitoring, feedback, and then policy formulation again. So this goes on and on. You cannot isolatedly talk about something without giving a reference to the previous links. So when we come to formulation, let's say, there is lack of consultation while formulating the policies. For example, when you take the case of tribals, so educating the tribals in English, this is not based on their needs. So this is not what they want. So this shows that there is lack of consultation when it comes to formulating and implementing welfare schemes in India. So there is lack of consultation. The second is that several of these welfare schemes are deal with one or two specific areas in which we need to consult some specialists, some experts of these areas. So this is not also happening. Thirdly, about data and statistics. Any good welfare scheme will need to be based upon thorough scientific data collected and analyzed, and this also many times doesn't happen. The next is populism. So several schemes are announced just before election, which accounts for populism, and therefore they are not carried on with more vigor once the elections are complete. So this is a fault with the formulation itself. So next we come to the implementation. The first thing is there are too many schemes. Because there are too many schemes, there is scarce resource allocation because the resources are very thinly distributed among these various schemes. So in one of the videos we saw how in the case of Manrega, the wages of the people who are working under Manrega have been held up to the extent of more than 40 crores because 40,000 crores because of no resources. There is no wage payment that is happening. So the second reason is that the beneficiaries are not aware of the welfare schemes. So they are not aware at all. For example, in several cases it was found under Vidyutikaran Yojana that the people were asked fees for getting electricity connection, and people did not even know that they don't have to give a fee for getting the connection. So similarly, under Swachh Bharat Abhiyan also, people would get a certain amount of money to construct their toilets, but there were several areas where 1,000, 2,000 rupees were given to the people that this is what you get under the scheme, and people accepted that itself because they didn't know how much they had to get. So the third is the personnel. So there will be a set of the personnel or the ministry which has to the cutting edge functionaries who are actually dealing with the implementation of the scheme day in and day out. But these personnel are not trained on as to how the scheme has to be implemented. Fourth is the infrastructure is very poor. For example, Anganwadi centers are the centers of implementation for say schemes like ICDS and all that. But several of these Anganwadi centers, they have very poor facilities of water, of fuel, lighting, toilets. So these are all very poor in the Anganwadi centers. So this shows about the poor infrastructure. So next is there is a focus more on the output rather than on the outcome. So which means, for example, under Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the focus is on building of toilets. So whether people are using those toilets, whether there is water available, whether this using of toilets has actually led to better health outcomes, nutritional outcomes, that is not analyzed. The focus is only on building toilets. So it has several times been found that these toilets have later become defunct because there is no water. These toilets have also been converted into storehouses. So the outcome of it is not measured. Just the fact that these many number of toilets are built is emphasized upon. The next important issue is corruption and leakages. So corruption and leakages, we can give the example of PDS, how several tons of grains, they just are, they just leak. There is so much of leakage and there is so much of middlemen and corruption in the PDS. Then is the last mile connectivity is also very poor. For example, when it comes to transporting the produce by the farmers, the transportation is poor. And when people have to get some benefit of a welfare scheme, they don't have bank branches nearby. So this last mile connectivity is also poor. Next is there is an institutional jungle. So this was also highlighted by the second Administrative Reforms Commission. So what it said was there was an institutional jungle. For implementing every particular scheme, a separate body is created to implement. So this way several institutions have now come into being, and each of them, they don't have any clearly demarcated areas of responsibility. There is overlapping roles that they have to play, and therefore there are several gray areas also. So because of the institutional jungle, the from this you can get the next important hurdle is because there is an institutional jungle and nobody clearly knows what each of these institutions' roles and responsibilities is. This leads to accountability being getting suffered. So there is no proper fixing of accountability for failures, and also for every welfare scheme, the most important integral part of any welfare scheme has to be the grievance redressal. So this grievance redressal mechanism is also not very strong and robust when it comes to several welfare schemes. So I have just listed down 10 of these issues. There will be many more, there are many more, but then in exam it all just boils down to how much you can prioritize and quickly mention more number of issues in less number of words. So this is what you have to do. Then even when it comes to feedback, yes, you can write that monitoring of the schemes, collection of the data during the implementation of the scheme is poor. So one of the important way by which the feedback could go regarding the implementation is through the social audit. Even though there are social audit reports, but then nothing happens out of that. So all of these things could be quoted. Then what do you conclude about the solution? You must always give a positive and reform-oriented conclusion at the end, indicating that if you adopt these changes, then you can definitely have a better tomorrow. So in this, you can say that we must have zero-based or outcome budgeting, performance-based budgeting. We must more promote competitive federalism. There must be more transparency in the fund allocation. We must improve the competence of the personnel. And at the end of the day, we must have a strong legal framework must be there. And we must have a strong institution, and then we must have participatory governance. So these are the three key ingredients which every welfare scheme must adhere to. So now we will come to the today's question. Direct benefit transfer can remove all the inefficiencies of the public distribution system. Comment. This is a question for 15 marks for 250 words. So try to at least form a mental map and jot down the broad framework of your answers. So that's it for today. Thank you.